Next week, our speaker is Bruce Tabashnik. Fred, do you want to say a word about him?
Yeah. Bruce Tabashnik is probably the leading authority in the world on resistance management of BT crops. And it's great. He's going to give a seminar in entomology on Monday, and then he'll be doing the colloquium on Tuesday. And Sharon's got them all set up to do one of the archives and things on Tuesday as well. But we have slots. Some of you have come forward and said you'd like to meet with him, but please send me an email to say you'd like to meet with him, because actually this afternoon I'll start working on his schedule, and you're all involved, and we'd like to do a lunch for him with students on Tuesday after the program. So we'll fit, some of the students have gotten in touch with me, but if you want to have a separate meeting with him, we can do that too, but we'll also set up a lunch meeting. So I'll be sending you a notification. But anyway, he's a really interesting guy. He's going to talk to us about trying to be an honest broker in all of this stuff. He's not as versed as you guys are in, reading books and stuff about that. He's just been trying to do it. So,
great. Thanks, Fred. And then the final week of the semester, we're going to have he's actually a PhD student from SUNY ESF in the lab that's working on developing the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And he's coming to participate in a workshop that a number of us are organizing for later in the week, but he agreed to come a bit early. In particular, he's been involved in helping to navigate the regulatory process for the tree. And so his perspective is, I think, is really exciting to hear for that final week. Other GES events that are scheduled for the next week or so. One preview is Jessica Barnes is going to be doing her dissertation defense a week from this Thursday, so that's April 19th. I'll tell you the time. It's going to start at, I think, 9 a.m., and so we'll make sure to announce that. As many of you know, the first hour is public, so it's open to the public, and so people can come and hear the work that she's done, and then the session becomes closed with just the committee members, but I encourage many to come and she's done some really great work.
So just to make sure everybody knows, June 4th and 5th, we're going to have a symposium that is titled
Forging Integrated Expertise. I don't know the rest. Forging Integrated Expertise
in Graduate Education, which is going to be the capstone to the aggregate program, which ends in July. And we'll have students presenting and doing posters. I just wanted to say that we'll be sending out invitations to everybody pretty soon. I'm not sure exact date, but pretty soon. We have the agenda and everything organized. But just keep those dates open for this symposium. We're going to have the director of the new NRT programs from NSF doing the keystone, and also Terry Lomax, who used to be the head of economic development here and research at NC State, and then with RTI is going to do the other capstone. So other keynotes, so a lot going on.
Great, thanks, Fred. Okay, let me turn it over to Zach to introduce our speaker today.
Yeah,
thanks, Zach.
Sure. We're very pleased to have Jesse Tack here today from Kansas State University, Department of Agricultural Economics. I've learned a couple things looking at his CV. So he started his faculty career at Mississippi State University in 2009, and then obviously now at Kansas State. I did his PhD at UC Berkeley in the Ag and Resource Economics program there, and did his bachelor's at UC Davis before that. So just a little bit of background about why we invited Jesse to this colloquium. So as you know, we've been talking a lot about Fred's experience co-chairing the National Academy's report on genetically engineered crops. That's been a topic, a recurring theme over the past several years in this colloquium. And so this paper that Jesse's presenting addresses one of the major question that came up in the report, which is, a lot of studies, there's very mixed evidence about the yield effects, the specific yield effects of genetically engineered crops. And so, like, micro-level studies have found one thing, basically, and aggregate studies, usually have aggregate level data, have found something different. And Jesse and his co-authors think they have an answer as to why that discrepancy is rising. So it's really addressing a major issue that we've talked about quite a bit. In terms of his research expertise, and I'll finish, Basically, looking at his publications and his CV, he's basically been addressing all the drivers of of yield effects on U.S. crop systems. That would be my take on what your work is with the body. So anything that's possibly affecting yield on U.S. crop systems, he's interested in it. That's hopefully a fair statement, including weather, technology, and a number of other factors. So I think with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever gotten such a good introduction where I don't even need to motivate the paper. That was awesome. Thank you. Really well said. And I am a sucker for a yield distribution. That's all I care about in life. It's like Emily, Cohen, other family, yield distribution. And I don't care if it's corn or wheat or sorghum or whatever. I've been kind of hooked on trying to understand the drivers of yield variability for a long time. I'm really excited to be here today. I think you guys are operating in a really fun space. I didn't receive any kind of formal education or introduction to interdisciplinary studies, but I really wish I would have, and I'm really jealous of the position that PhD students and candidates are in to get this sort of exposure. One of the reasons I like it so much is there's tremendous upside to learning something for the first time, right? If you learn something about someone else's discipline, you kind of feel like you gained a lot that one day. The introductory material, there's kind of a high marginal benefit towards learning that for a lower cost, and then of course that sort of binds as you study something longer and longer. One of the downsides is it's really hard to communicate across disciplines. I'm sure you guys have interacted with other colleagues in other disciplines, and there's almost like a language barrier a lot of times. And it's so much better that you guys are eliminating that barrier now than when you go and become assistant professors, right? You're still kind of in this, not quite student, but you're in less of a publishing for your life sort of world, and so you can spend a little bit more time practicing writing, which no one likes to do, and practicing speaking someone else's language, which a lot of us don't like to do in the sense that it takes time away from the stuff that we really like to do our own analysis. So I'm super jealous. I wish I was in your guys' shoes. I wish I would have had an experience like this. So I'm very honored to be here and thankful for the invitation. This is a new area of work for me. I've done a lot of stuff related to climate change, crop insurance, other sort of yield drivers, that sort of thing. I guess GMO sort of stuff, GE stuff was always implicitly there, but it wasn't something that I was recognizing or trying to account for directly in my research. So I'm pretty new to this area, right? So this is really the first paper I've done on GE, and so I think, what I said earlier, there's a lot of upside for me interacting with you guys, and I think I stand to learn a lot. I'm thankful for the conversations I've already had today with some of you, and look forward to the ones to have later today. All right, I'm already off topic. Okay, so I love this title. I think especially if you're working in an interdisciplinary space, it's kind of nice to put your most citable finding in the title, and then remind people in the abstract, the introduction, the results, and all right, so maybe we'll unpack it a little bit. I'm bookended here by two people that are a lot smarter than me, Jason Luss, Nathan Hendricks, and then myself in the middle. It's a boring paper for me because we're all ag economists. I think about half of my researchers tend to work with crop scientists, agronomists, people from other disciplines. I really enjoy that sort of interaction. But here we're all dismal scientists. Jason is a super big picture guy, so he loves like the yield impacts result. Like that's Jason's result. He wants the overall, what have I learned at the end of the day. I think Nathan is a little bit more nuanced, not saying that's better or worse, but he really likes heterogeneity, right? So he does a lot of sort of interaction between environmental stuff and agricultural economics. So he likes this sort of heterogeneity thing. And I think like, those are the two wheels, and I think I'm the axle, just in the middle, just trying to keep us between the two lines. And I get really excited about this controlling for weather result. This is one of the few projects where I think all three of us, you could randomly assign lead authorship here, and I don't think anyone would really raise an argument. It was such a sort of positive joint experience. It was great. Loved it. All right. So productivity in agriculture, we've got food and environmental security considerations, food security going forward. We've got a lot of technological regimes that have happened historically, and I think it's always worth looking back over our shoulder, understanding what the bottom line impacts were on yields, and that might give us some sort of understanding about what sort of yield gains we might potentially expect going forward. This is, right, so Zach said it way better than I could possibly say it, but essentially you've got micro-level results that aren't really mashing up with the more aggregate kind of observational results, right? So here we've got kind of this famous graph of corn yields, US aggregate corn yields from 1980, 2016, kind of perfectly spanning. The adoption data doesn't start until 1999, but adoption started taking up in 1996. So you've got this nice set of years on either side of this adoption that started taking place, and you fit a linear trend to this data series, and you don't see any sort of evidence of a break in this trend relationships, right? Yields were going up by as much per year down in this period as they were in this period, all right? So if you're taking this at face value, you're walking away from this sort of limited, in my mind, data exercise and saying that there doesn't really seem to be any sort of signal of GE adoption for corn in the US. And I guess coming from kind of a climate change sort of research background, I really care about those weather variables. And I've seen the non-linearities that creep up in crop yields when you have extreme heat, when you've got a lot of water stress. All right, there's sort of these tail weather events that are sort of infrequent, but when they happen, they really push yields around. All right, so even though a yield-weather relationship isn't interesting here, my mind immediately goes to this place of, okay, maybe we need to be controlling for weather as a potentially confounding influence, even though our goal is really to estimate this trend. All right, you start asking that question, and you start noticing that there's kind of three big shocks that were happening in the 80s prior to GE adoption, and it doesn't seem to really be balanced out in that post-GE period. All right, it would seem like the weather was a lot better post-GE than it was pre-GE. All right, so that might give us some indication that if we start controlling for weather, if we try and remove its influence on yield, we might get a very different trend relationship. And that's essentially what happens, all right? So we're going to take that corn yield data, we're going to focus on individual ag crop reporting districts, all right? So each crop reporting district has 5, 6, 7 counties inside of it, and we're going to estimate a trend yield relationship for 3 different types of models. All right, the first model is that blue one that's almost perfectly hidden by the next one. That's just going to be that linear trend, that model that we saw on the previous slide. The next one is say, okay, maybe we want to count for some structural change in GE yield trend relationship coinciding with when adoption started. All right, so we're going to do a spline function. Essentially, we're going to allow for the slopes to be different pre-1996 and post-1996. And when you do that, those 2 models sit right on top of each other. All right, so for allowing for a structural break in 1996 hasn't changed the story at all until you add some additional weather variables to that yield specification. You control for those confounding influences on yields. All right, essentially what you're going to be doing is you're taking these big shocks and you're weather adjusting those yields up accordingly. All right, so what happens? Well, now we start to see a divergence between that trend yield relationship. All right, so coinciding with the availability and adoption of GE corn in the US, if you control for weather, you're able to tease out a change in that trend yield relationship. And neither of the other 2 models are really capable of generating that sort of finding. And it's really robust, all right? You start seeing, you see this result all across Iowa. These are all the different ag reporting districts in Iowa. You see the same thing is going on in Ohio, and across nearly all of these Corn Belt states, you're seeing the exact same finding that when you control for weather, and only after controlling for weather, do you see a difference between those trend yields before and after GE adoption. So that's it. I mean, the advice I've always gotten is put your results at the very beginning of the presentation. That's it. That's really the main story that I have. We can all just kind of doze off, check our email, whatever, and hopefully I've just implanted that one sort of main finding in your brains today, all right? If that's the only thing I've done today, I'll be extremely, extremely happy. All right, so what else can we say? Well, if our story is going to hold, then we better actually observe weather differences in that pre and post GE period. All right, so we need this whole thing to come together. We have a statistical result right here. I'm making an argument that we're seeing a lot more worse weather for yields in this pre-GE period than we're seeing in that post-GE period. Let's actually look at the weather data and see if that's true. All right? Okay, precipitation. All right? Every single county has a certain amount of cumulative precipitation during the crop's growing season. I'm going to take the average of that cumulative precipitation across all of the years in the pre and post period, and I'm just going to look at the difference between that. All right, so what are we seeing? In general, we're seeing that there's wetter, more favorable yield conditions in that post-GE period. All right? Prior to the GE adoption period, we had much drier conditions. All right, so things are moving in the right direction on the precipitation side of things. It's a wetter growing environment post-GE, more conducive to crop yields. And let's look at extreme heat. All right, so here extreme heat is just defined as cumulative temperature exposures above 29 degrees Celsius. All right, so how often do temperatures get above 29 degrees Celsius? Again, we've got that information at the county level for every single growing season. Let's take the average across growing seasons in the pre and post period and look and see what happens. We're seeing a reduction of extreme heat in the post-GE period. All right, so you're getting less bad weather. You're getting more favorable conditions. All right, so at this point, things are starting to line up. The other point I'd make is it's not just one clean story. It's not that extreme heat was lower in every single county. All right, this is a highly localized sort of phenomenon. All right, here we actually have an increase in extreme heat down in Texas. You have a reduction of extreme heat up in Iowa. All right, so this is a very localized thing. In general, we see more favorable conditions, but that's not true of everywhere. All right, so how can we possibly get an estimate of the GE yield effect using all these different counties if we've got localized confounding factors? All right, this sort of problem sets up really nicely for regression analysis. And that's the approach that we take here. We're going to do some sort of trend specification in a regression model, literally like the first statistics class that you've ever taken. It's like a single covariate of interest. It's a trend variable. And then we're just going to ask how that trend estimate changes when we consider different sets of controls. All right, so that's all we're doing here. We've got yields that are varying by county and also time. We've got an adoption variable. So rather than putting trends in the model specifically, we're going to go to the USDA data, and they're going to tell us at the state level in a specific year what percentage of acreage was sown to GE corn. All right, so this is going to be a number between 0 and 1. This estimate right here, delta, tells you the amount of yield gain you should expect if you were to switch from non-GE to GE. All right, so even though this is kind of a share variable right here, we can interpret it at a micro level as a switch from 0 to 1. All right, essentially turning things on. And then that's the JSON result. That's what Jesse cares about a whole lot. And then Nathan gets his heterogeneity result as well. All right, so Nathan went and got some really good soil survey data, and essentially we're going to consider different grouping schemes. All right, so we're going to aggregate this kind of gridded soil up to the county level. We're going to measure the water holding capacity of the soil, as well as some soil texture classifications. And our big interest there is whether or not this estimate is different for different soil conditions. All right, so what did we find? Full adoption of GE increased yield by 18 bushels per acre. It was roughly about 17%. So in this particular sample, yields were averaging about 100 bushels per acre in 1995 before adoption started. The impact varies across soils. Pretty big range of impacts there. All right, this provides some evidence that maybe this modeling approach is capable of capturing all those different sort of micro-localized results that seem to be very different from study to study. All right, so we're seeing a pretty broad representation of those crop yield effects, and then if you get rid of those weather controls, the effect completely goes away. All right, so it's key for identification, key for estimation of these effects. Okay, so I've already shown you some maps, so you have a pretty good idea of how many counties are used in this analysis. This is all mass, dry land, corn production. We're going to omit any county that has a large percentage of irrigated acreage. All right, so if a county reports more than 10% of irrigated acreage, we're dropping that county from the analysis. So this can largely be considered dry land production systems. We've got roughly an equal number of years, pre and post GE, all right, so 1980 to 2015, and we've got a whole bunch of observations, which is really nice from a statistical perspective, but the reason why we're getting this number is we're pooling a whole lot of potentially dissimilar yield series, all right, so it's really important that we take into account that the soil quality characteristics down in Texas might be very different than those up in Wisconsin. All right, so we're going to try and build those sort of controls into our regression model as well. What do these adoption curves look like? Zach can testify to this. In economics, we look at a lot of adoption-related sort of technology examples. You guys probably do in your other fields as well. It's always fascinating to me that this S-curve relationship seems to hold empirically, right? You get kind of a slow amount of initial adoption, new takers, then it kind of ramps up through the middle, and then it turns back over towards the end. All right, we have state-level adoption data, and so this is really the cross-sectional limitation of our analysis. We only have adoption data for these states, and you'll see for a few states, North Dakota, Texas, they didn't even start surveying for adoption till like I think 2006, 2007. Even in the best case scenario, we're missing some of those initial 1996 years. They only started this survey in 1999. So we do a little bit of a data interpolation process here, but as a robustness check, we considered not doing it and just using the raw data, and the results were pretty much the same. Pretty well recognized weather data set. Essentially, we've got some prism grid cells underlying the production accounts in each county. We're going to take the data from those prism grid cells and we're going to aggregate them up to the county level. We're going to define March through August as our growing season. These results are pretty insensitive to different definitions of that growing season, whether or not you allow the season to be a little bit longer up in Wisconsin, a little bit shorter in places down further south like Kansas and Texas. Cumulative precipitation, and then we essentially just had some degree day variables that are capturing the intensity of these heat effects. All right, this is the big yield driver right here. When temperatures get above 29 degrees Celsius, you see a lot of heat stress on these plants, and the yields drop. This is really Nathan's area of expertise. The point that I would make is that the soil characteristics that we're accounting for in our model is the water holding capacity of the soil, essentially how deep and how well it can retain water, and then also based on kind of that soil texture triangle interaction, we've got, I think, 9 different soil texture classifications. I'm not going to report the results for here, I'm going to focus on the water holding capacity, but those are available in the paper. Okay, so we see a lot of variation in the water holding capacity across these counties. This is the thing that is super boring and kind of lame at the end of the day, but this is my aha moment, right? We all kind of live for that analysis, sort of, at least I'm kind of an analyst first and a researcher by profession, right? Someone has to pay me. I am lucky enough to get to do analysis over and over again. The way that I kind of get that opportunity is by producing research. But what I love is this particular kind of the singular moment of I guess what we call discovery, right? When you're sitting there and you get your results back and you see something that really pops out at you. All right, we have different control features here. These are just different sets of regression variables that we're adding to the model. And what we can see, this is the coefficient estimate on our adoption rate variable. This is essentially going to tell you that GE yield bump that you get from switching from non-GE to GE corn. And this would say that it goes up 43 bushels per acre. All right. We haven't even accounted for the trend in yields that we've seen over time. We haven't accounted for weather controls and some other sort of features of the underlying data as well. All right, so that's a pretty irresponsible estimate right there. I don't trust it. The reason why I don't trust it is I can start adding a simple linear trend to that specification, and that thing ducks below 0 and is now pretty negative in the other direction. All right, this thing is pinging around as I add more variables to the specification. I'm going to include some county fixed effects. It's going to ping back to the other side of 0. All right, this thing is huge, negative, other side of 0. It's moving around, and this is the number that we settled on, because after including these weather covariates to the model, we considered a lot more models over here where we are adding more and more variables to this specification, and that estimate just stabilized. All right, it was really hard to find any other specifications that included weather controls that didn't give us a point estimate, an estimate for that adoption effect that was around sort of in that sort of 15 to 25 range. All right, so this thing's bouncing around all over the place, and then it tended to settle down when we added those weather controls into the model. 18 bushels per acre is really just an average effect across all these different counties. So if we want to start figuring out how much heterogeneity there might be, we can allow for different water holding capacity categories. All right, I think we considered 5 or 6 in total, and we'd estimate a separate effect for each of those. All right, so if we look at kind of our maximum value down here and our minimum value, what we're seeing is we're seeing a pretty broad range of this GMO adoption effect on crop yields across these different soil classifications. All right, so highly localized effect, even after controlling for the effects of weather. One of the things that seems to correlate with that localized effect pretty well are these soil quality variables. All right, overall, no significant GE effect if we omit weather. All right, it seemed to be a pretty important control variable. Our estimate on average was about a 17% yield bump, comparable to a lot of experimental estimates, but we also found a wide range of heterogeneity, which could potentially explain some of the different estimates people are getting in these experimental trials. And then, of course, the GES finding that controlling for weather is an important consideration when estimating these sorts of effects. And that's all I got. You guys have been very polite in letting me babble. And now I think it's time for me to pay up, and I'm sure we have some really good concerns about this analysis, and hopefully I get a chance to learn a lot from you guys' questions and comments. Yeah, sorry.
Would it be wrong to also read this as suggesting that work on addressing abiotic factors could potentially be more valuable than the things that GE currently targets in corn?
So that's awesome, right? So we've got our second, third generation of GE corn. that's adopted in some places, but still fairly new. And I would interpret that question as whether or not the new wave is capable of generating yield gains that are similar to the first wave. Whether or not going after those sort of weather-related stresses can produce additional yield gains that are comparable to the ones that we saw targeting pests and weeds. I don't know. So I have another paper that we've been working on where we compare these estimates to climate change impacts, and the whole question is what should we expect on aggregate from a food security setting going forward when climate change materializes. And that was our point in that paper was really like we've had these two regimes, pre-GE, post-GE, hybridization, pre-GE, post-GE. You have yield gains associated with each, and I don't have a clue which one is going to be more representative of the gains we see going forward. So I don't have a good answer other than I'm really interested in the answer that you generate to that sort of question. Yeah?
Is there any way to tease apart the effect of the GM trait and then the seed quality? Because they have, you know, all that proprietary.
From a data standpoint, yes. So from a data standpoint, those same adoption rate kind of curves that I put up, you can get those that are trait specific. So you can get those for herbicide tolerant, you can get those for BT resistant, each one of those traits individually. The problem is at some point they start stacking them, in which case, you know, I don't know the exact year, but let's just say 2010, a lot of people are buying seeds that have those traits stacked into them. So there is a window sort of early on in the adoption period where people were kind of adopting trait-specific varieties, and that might be the best bet to tease those sort of things out. So I think there's some potential here, but it isn't something that we went after directly.
Sorry, that wasn't my question. Sorry. I was wondering, you know, like you have BT traits, you've got HT traits, all of that. Is there a way to tease that modification apart from the seed quality? So like all the plant breeding that's still going on at these companies.
Yeah, the best thing we can do with this sort of data is use that pre-GE period to estimate some trend and assume that essentially that trend continues on, and we're going to try and estimate some sort of deviation from that. I would consider that probably to be the biggest limiting factor of this sort of analysis, is you don't get that pure counterfactual kind of side by side. So what do? Well, you can go pick your favorite EU country, and you can do some country by country comparisons. We've taken this data and we've put it side by side with French data, and we find largely the same estimate of a yield bump from that GE adoption. There's a lot of problems with that sort of analysis because you've got to find the right counties in the US that have similar climates to the districts that are in France. So there's some matching sort of stuff from like an experimental design that we haven't probably fully conceptualized and incorporated into our model, but at least the preliminary results are pretty consistent with what we're finding here. Yeah. Sorry I misunderstood, really good question. Yeah.
Not a corn person. Is there a way to tease out if this corn is like for like feed, if the corn is like for human consumption? Like,
yeah, it's all U.S. sort of #2 feed grain here. I found out recently that there's GE white maize in South Africa. At least that's what someone told me. And I thought that was really interesting because from a global perspective, I think that's one of the few places where we've got GE maize that's kind of going direct from the field to the consumer without a big processing sort of thing happening in between. It's not going into some animal's belly and then showing up on our plate. It's more direct consumption. I haven't confirmed that. That's just something that I heard. But along the lines of what you're talking about, I think that would be really interesting to look at because it's more of that direct interface with consumers. Yeah.
On the societal aspect of what you're looking at, would you care to comment on some of the things that might be inherent in human behavior as far as farmers and seed utilization and something that the data might not show? I mean, I don't have a hypothesis, I'm just, you know,
Can you direct just a little bit more?
You know, just, maybe, and I'm not a corn person either, but utilization of seeds that were collected from the year before that don't show up, or reporting issues that farmers say, oh, you know, early on, or don't want to be associated with GE and things like that, aspects like that. And again, it's an overly broad question. I apologize for that.
No, I really appreciate it. I guess the thing that always comes back into my mind is if we're currently near 100% adoption of acreage in the US, why weren't we there in 2000? Why has it taken to 2015? If you, so separately, but I think the answer is probably related. If you look at crop insurance enrollments, right? So a lot of producers will purchase crop insurance for their production. Corn's huge. Enrollment is now similar to GE. It's like at 92% of acreage has some sort of crop insurance contract on it. Heavily subsidized. Producers pay about 50% of, you know, kind of the calculated cost of this product. It has a really similar adoption curve to GE corn. Kind of really with crop insurance, it's kind of mid-80s, late 80s, you S-curve, and then you come up, and it isn't until recent years that there's this full adoption. So there's something about farmers that I think is, we operate in a very uncertain world. There's a ton of variability around me. People have been marketing the silver bullet fix to me for as long as I've been farming. There's a little bit something, there's like a conservatism towards the unknown that I think might be inherent among producers. And you have some that jump right in and try the new things, the early adopters. But I wonder if that couldn't help explain sort of both things that are puzzles to me. Given that we got close to 100% adoption, why didn't we get there quicker? I don't know. I think about this all the time. It's some sort of behavioral thing, or maybe we can use sort of economic models to get some ideas there. I don't know. Yeah.
So I have a sort of a broad question about how did you decide when you, I mean, you gave a really nice illustration of how you had this, you know, huge table of effects and you added variables and you basically stopped seeing a difference.
Yeah.
But how did you decide that you were satisfied enough to stop looking for that other variable that might swing things around or explain more? And related to that, you know, how is it that all the studies that Fred's committee looked at, nobody thought to control for weather? Like, you know, how does this happen from your perspective, being in this discipline, that you get this pretty amazing results and have to have the confidence with your co-authors to stand by it and say, we've done enough, and a lot of other people didn't think of this?
I'm going to unpack all of the cool stuff that's going on in there as best as I can. So please remind me when I forget to answer a piece of that. When to stop? We largely got to that point, and then we started thinking about, okay, maybe there's small parts of this data set that's driving the results. So we largely considered a lot of robustness checks where, you know, maybe those early adopters, maybe there was something inherently different about them. So let's get them out of the data. And we'll go from, you know, 80 to 1996, and then we're going to pick up at like 2010 to 2015, and kind of throw out that whole middle sort of adoption phase and more of a 0-1 kind of pre-post thing. And the result was largely steady to that. At some point we said, look, there's no pure counterfactual in this data, and that drives us crazy. So we kind of just put a cork in it and said, you know what we have to do next? We have to go find some EU countries that might give us a different source of identification, a different sort of estimating experimental design. And so we kind of hit pause, went and collected that data, and the preliminary results started suggesting that there was a similar number associated with it. We do demonstrate, so, and we're not the first study to control for weather. There's other studies that have controlled for weather. I think we're the, if not one of the first studies to really demonstrate how the estimate changes when you don't include it in the framework. So that's another point that I would make. And then I would say, you know, there's a ton of heterogeneity going on here. There's certain areas in this data set where the yield gain was, you know, 5 bushels per acre, and that'll probably show up as statistically insignificantly different from 0. So there's kind of that flavor of very localized effects, that sort of thing. If I can, this is stupid, I'm going to say it anyways. If I can pick on crop scientists, what I would say is so much of their field trial approach is their identification comes from well thought out experimental design. They're going to have some benchmark variety, and then they're going to have a new variety next to it. And they're always going to look at side-by-side comparisons. And so I think this is probably wrong, and it might be not representative of current thought. But when I look at a lot of that literature, I see too much reliance on the experimental design for getting at their kind of econometric estimates or their statistical estimates. And if you have two different varieties that respond to a certain stress very differently, then just differencing across them isn't going to kind of control for whether or not that stress was present in any one particular year. So I think part of it might just be sort of, you know, they put a lot of time and effort into their experimental designs. They're very good, they're smart about it, but maybe they don't fully appreciate that there's potentially some other confounders out there as well. I don't know. That might be an understanding.
Sorry, it's a related question. Is that like, would you characterize that as an external versus internal validity issue for those experiments? So they're designed to be very internally valid, but then extrapolating might be difficult because of the confounding factors you're talking about.
I'm not saying yes, but I think even internally, you know, we talk about bias. And it's not sort of a systematic bias like we talk about. It's almost like incidentally the weather just happened to be bad in one of the years of my trial, and I didn't control. My concern would be both internally and externally.
Well, I just want to pick up on Joanna's point and Jason's. You know, I guess I agree, you know, like the disaggregating and looking at the pieces is important, but as an entomologist, you know, I think, okay, what are these traits, as Joanna was bringing up? And they're basically two that are GE, not that there aren't other traits, but the two GE traits are the herbicide tolerance and the insects. And I think, okay, the herbicide tolerance, everybody who's looked at that seems to say that gives the farmers more flexibility and all that, but it really doesn't affect yield. And that's not to say that they're right. It could be that these folks are wrong. So, but to me, it leaves the insect stuff as the main thing. And I guess, so there are a couple of things in your results that are surprising, and I think we need to, you know, that's why I said with Jason, like, where do you stop? Yeah. And one of my pieces is to think about that later data on the 2011 and so on, when the European corn borer, which was one of the main targets, was almost non-existent anymore. Yeah. So they weren't contributing to that. And the corn rootworm was equally controlled by the pesticides that we used before as well as these. So I'm trying to think of, okay, where is this yield change come from? And that's where I go back to, I think Joanna's point is a good one, you know, in terms of, is it the GE, or is it the fact that the companies are breeding stronger, or is it the farmers are realizing the prices are going up, so they're putting more nitrogen on? You know, I'm trying to, and then the other piece was in terms of the insect thing, that you didn't see a decrease in variability. Right, I think that was something that you, in your study, but not in the previous one. So I'm trying to untangle that. And one of the reasons I talked to Zach about having you come down here is that I think there's room for taking that next step and asking, where is this change coming from? Yeah. So anyway, I'd love your comments on that.
No, I think at the end of the day, we've got sort of a reduced form result here, where things are correlating with other things.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of irresponsible for me to start picking out my favorite mechanism. I think it's more of a thing for, I would like to see the broader scientific community kind of digest this and spit back in their own particular discipline what they think is potentially a causal driver here. There was another.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. This is, you know, this cause and effect thing that as entomologists we always drive onto, and as opposed to pattern.
One of the things that's going on here too is you've got a massive expansion of crop acreage underlying this trend. And one could argue and probably detect whether or not this is more marginal land coming into production that maybe was fallow before, or maybe it's prime land that's switching over from another crop, right? A ton of winter wheat land in Kansas has switched over to corn. You know, what way does that direction go? Are we bringing in more marginal land? Are we bringing in higher land? That's confounded in here as well. The assistance of the weather variables to aid identification, I think, is a useful empirical tool, and I think it's been underutilized. I think there's a ton of conversation to be had about what potentially could cause you to be related to some of these kind of stylized empirical facts that we have here. The yield risk thing I should be very clear about. I think we phrase things inappropriately in the abstract. So we estimated the variance of corn yields, and we found that there was not a statistically significant effect. All right. So what our conclusion was that we didn't find any evidence that the variance of yields went down after GE was adopted. All right. That coefficient estimate was actually negative. Okay. So if anything, there's some directional suggestion that maybe there was a reduction of variance. The other thing I'd point out is, variance is a horrible way to measure risk. If you know variance and you don't know anything about the mean, the average value, you don't know anything about risk in that particular situation. If I have a mean of 1 and a variance of 1, that's a heck of a lot different situation than if I have a mean of 1 million and a variance of 1. Same variance, one of them's a heck of a lot riskier than the other. And so when we have this yield gain associated with a likely negative, if not zero, change in the variance, we actually have a coefficient of variation that's going down. So if we think that normalized measure of variance is kind of more appropriate for capturing risk, there's some evidence from this analysis that the production has become less risky. Now that wasn't well stated in our abstract. We kind of made the conclusion about the variance in the abstract and left it at that, and buried a sentence in the results about things being less risky. But it was actually pretty short-sighted of us not to more directly kind of frame that result. I think especially when you start talking about risk-reducing features of GE Biotechnology, that's a very interesting sort of finding, and people can, the way that variance result is phrased, people can run with it in different directions. And so that was potentially pretty short-sighted of us. So I'm just happy to have the opportunity to hear that. Yeah.
Right. I totally agree. Coefficient variation is so much more important. So I just say, I think that there's room to go from what you have in terms of pattern to figure out what's behind that, because there are so many factors that have changed since 1996. That result in that, especially since 2011. And I think that getting into what the mechanism that could cause that would be pretty interesting, because I think to call it GE is overstating the case, because think about what's happened to crop breeding, and also think of what's happened with precision agriculture at this time. Yep. So to use the term GE may be making almost a conclusion that's not warranted from the data on crop yield.
Yeah.
But not to I think it's a great paper. Yeah. I mean, it's really good to do that, but I think that now is the time to sort of ask the question, is it really due to those two traits?
Yeah. I mean, you've got the pesticide seed treatments that are parallel.
Yes, right.
So you would know this then. Where do I get a good pest map that varies by growing season, by spatially, by year, going back to 1980? Where do I get that?
So actually, in terms of European corn borer and in terms of corn rootworm, you can get quite a bit of that.
Yeah.
But not in all those states. I'm not sure what Texas has. But if you go up to the Midwest and you look at Illinois, Wisconsin, and actually there's that paper in Science by Hutchinson that shows that European corn borer thing. People gave up even looking for European corn borer in Illinois because they couldn't find them. So if you're seeing that trend when you don't have the test, and there have been some, actually, just, I don't want to take up too much time, but say there are some studies that are on that other side where they did it in people's fields, where they found a yield increase when they actually measured the pest population and there wasn't a pest population. So there's certainly something else going on here in those experiments. That granted, those are experiments.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
We'll talk more. It's good.
Yeah.
So Fred, I'm thinking about what you said. So your committee accepted when people said that before GE and after GE didn't change.
Right.
So you accepted that definition before and post GE that you just sort of challenged him on. And there could have been other factors.
Right.
Right.
You're right. I totally agree with you on that. And that's our problem. I think that was the null hypothesis that we accepted.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of like when you see a change, you have to ask what is causing change. You don't see a change, you say, well, nothing's changed. But I agree, because people have also brought up that climate change if, you know, you hadn't had it, it would have gone down.
And 35 million acres of new corn, and I think probably more likely marginal acres.
That'd be my,
Yeah.
that would be my guess if
Yeah.
prices were not so different among crops during that period, and there was so much incentive to continuously crop corn. I understand that usually is associated with drag, but just like your kind of marginal corn belt states, I think you have a lot of conversion from one crop to another, and I'm not convinced in those specific cases that would be marginal there. Maybe relative to Iowa, but location specific. Maybe there was actually some good soils going from winter wheat to corn in
Yeah,
Kansas.
but I think there are figures on like 35 million acres of conservation reserve when in corn, plus some acreage shield.
Yeah.
But I wasn't surprised when you showed your adoption, but my question was more about this. You showed your adoption thing, because in extension, we sort of expect that. We have what we call early adopters, then the laggers or whatever, they're gonna watch your neighbors, oh yeah, that does work. And then the final people, I forget what they call them, maybe they're the laggers, that adopt very late. But we saw something very different in cotton. We saw much more rapid wholesale adoption. And I think it goes back to, Fred mentioned that, well, maybe controlling weeds is easier in some of these herbicide tolerant technologies. But in cotton, it was better. So maybe there's some yield gain there, and actually you could switch from herbicides that were damaging cotton that you had to use anyway, or you're not going to be able to harvest your crop, to a safe herbicide. So the adoption was just totally not what we expected, just like,
Do you think individual farmers were in some sense internalizing what people were probably seeing on the consumer side of things from a very early period, that it just kind of spooks me to put a pesticide into this food that's going to be at some point consumed?
Maybe, and the cotton farmers didn't have that.
They didn't have that problem.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I think their weed control was much more difficult and costly, both from an injury standpoint and actual economic standpoint.
It's just considered kind of normal to see that sort of
Yeah.
slow, whatever pace you want to
Mhm.
call it, S-curve. I find that fascinating, because I
Yeah.
don't think, we have a hard time in economics coming up with a model that's capable of saying, you're going to get there eventually, but some people are going to get there quicker than others. It's hard to think of, it almost has to be an individual specific sort of uncertainty about the outcome. I mean, we can twist our models in knots trying to answer those sorts of questions, but kind of a standard neoclassical economic model isn't really capable of capturing those sort of stylized facts. I'm fascinated by adoption curves. Now we seem to have the same shape. It's always like pretty slow, speed up to the middle, and then turn over.
Maybe we can get Zach to do some work on that. Zach and then do some work on cotton where you had sort of a different adoption.
Yeah, no, I'd really like to look, truthfully I haven't looked at those statistics, so I'm keen to go back and look at them and see how more rapid that pace was. Cool, thank you. Yeah.
So on the question of risk and variability, if your best assessment is that risk has not been going up, yet people have continued to purchase crop insurance, that would typically be a response to risk. So is it explained by price decrease in the insurance, or else are people having a perception of risk that doesn't seem to match the data?
That's the million-dollar question. So that getting back to highly subsidized crop insurance and why producers were slow to adopt it at the levels they're currently using it at, I don't think economics gets you all the way. I think there's something beyond what we would consider to be kind of a standard economic explanation or a standard sort of economic model, more behavioral stuff. I'm intrigued by this idea that they don't know how valuable something is, and they don't even really have a good idea assigning probabilities to whether or not it's a winner or a loser. Like, they're just pretty agnostic about their future state of being once they adopt something, and then they learn from watching other people. That seems pretty intuitive to me, but I don't know if even that gets you all the way there. But the crop
crop insurance, though, it's not just production risk, that's the problem. So it covers price risk as well in most cases.
But even at such a highly subsidized level, independent of the economic sort of environments that we've seen changing over the last couple of decades, buying it now, if you're going to buy it now, you probably should have bought it 10 or 15 years ago as well.
That's true.
Yeah. I have two questions, ideas. One is, so I'm really interested in that inflection point analysis, and did you run models to see if you arbitrarily assigned the inflection point in different years?
It picked up 1996 right on the nose.
Okay. So
we did an out-of-sample sort of validation exercise, and it sat right on top of it.
Okay.
It's kind of nice. You're like, oh,
yeah.
what I would expect or hope.
The second question is, does your analysis allow you to say anything about like where these GE crops are most likely to make a bigger difference in terms of either soil types and things like that, or assuming that climate change models are right and we're going to see more heat stress of crops in many regions? Can we say anything there, or does your data not let us speak to that?
Literally a paper I'm presenting this afternoon over in the Ag Econ department is we take those county-specific estimates and we put on top of them county-specific climate change impacts. And what's kind of interesting is under the business as usual, worst case, end of century climate change scenario, is you need the gains from what we've identified as the gains associated with GE adoption to pretty much perfectly nullify the worst case climate change scenario. And anything short of that isn't going to get you there. So it's kind of like, okay, you see these two different point estimates for these yield trends. Who cares? How can I contextualize the importance of that divergence? And so when you're thinking climate change is a nice way to kind of contextualize those two different things.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So in corn, during this period when you had more adoption of the insurance, crop insurance, was there a change in the government programs for corn during that period?
I mean, slight changes over time, but it's not like we went from a subsidy of 10% to 80%. I wouldn't say within the crop insurance program there wasn't a radical shift in program design. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Yeah.
There's like periodic increases in subsidy levels, let's say 2008, for example, in the farm bill. There's that 1997 requirement that you have to have crop insurance to get disaster payments, but outside of that, it's sort of the structure is pretty much the same.
See, that was I would think it's a pretty big driver that you have to get disaster payments. And also when cotton got dropped from being a program crop, and you lost some of their safety net, so theirs went up very high, but I don't know.
Yeah, so programs outside of crop insurance, you have some changes for sure. Decoupled payments going away, that sort of thing.
Just before we close, I just want to make sure anybody who didn't have a chance to ask a question have one that's lurking. Okay, well, please join me in thanking Jesse. We'll see you next week. In the discussion section, folks, let's meet quickly over here to the meeting.